Hello, my name is Marcus Ruiz Evans. I've somehow found myself as the most informed documenter of the coming dissolution of the United States of America. Now, if you had talked to me years ago uh, about that role, I never would have thought I'd have that. I simply wanted to write a book in 2012 called California's Next Century, which was about how California had a different culture from America. That has turned into explaining why California should secede, and that has turned into me being more informed than anyone in America about why America will probably come to dissolution, or at least allow a few states to engage in national divorce. And I'd like to show you some of the evidence that we have now. So first, to let you know why you should be paying attention to this. Well, in 339 BC, the Greek Empire was one of the strongest empires known in history. There was a man called Socrates, the wisest man ever documented in history. And he said that the Greeks made a mistake attempting to invade another country so far away. The Greek people did not want to hear this. What they wanted to hear was that their army was the best and their generals were super brilliant. And they didn't want to hear any discussion about how sending invasion forces very far away from Greece was a bad strategic move for Greece, and it set them up for failure a long time. Now, Socrates was totally right. The Greek people tried to invade Spain, I believe, and it went horribly, and they lost money and prestige, and they never regained. But when Socrates brought this up, they didn't want to hear it. So Greece ordered the smartest man in the world to kill himself because he questioned the intelligence of the moves the entire Greek Empire was making. He's not alone. In 410 AD, there was a group called the Goths, and they were at the gates of Rome. Now, Rome was still a very powerful empire, and the barbarians showed up at the gates, and they said, "Let us in, or give us all your gold." Now, the Romans were the height of civilization, and the barbarians were barbarians. So the Roman people could not picture the idea of negotiating with barbarians because they weren't Roman, they were beneath them. So even when Rome was surrounded, and even when the barbarians were at the gates, and even when it looked like they could invade them, the Romans couldn't get the concept in their heads that they had been defeated and were going to be beaten by non-Romans. They just couldn't understand. And so they did not give their gold to the barbarians. And then the barbarians invaded them anyways, raped all the women, killed all the men, and then took the gold anyways. The Romans could have gave them the gold, but they didn't want to hear that kind of talk. Then we go to England in World War II, 1945, and there was a guy called Winston Churchill, about 1942 actually, who said, "We can't bring the military to England to protect England. We have to keep the military in the colonies or they'll lose the colonies." What that allowed was England to get beaten on the European continent and then pushed back to England and then bombed for the first time since the medieval ages. So because Churchill did not want to bring troops out of the colonies because they couldn't afford to get rid of the colonies, he didn't adequately defend England, and England got bombed during the Blitz. And then they lost the colonies anyways. Now we look at the USA in 2020. And the point is this, that there's a book by a man called Jared Diamond, a famous professor, and the book's called Collapse. Now, he looked at Polynesian cultures on Easter Island, to the Anasazi in America, to the Mayans, and to the colony in Greenland. And this is an academic study of why empires or groups collapse. In every single situation, the people had developed a good infrastructure and a good country, and things were going well. But when the environment changed, they couldn't adapt. So for the Mayans, when the wells started going dry, they didn't move and they didn't reduce the amount of density in their civilizations. They just kept going. Same thing with the Anasazi. When drought came, they just kept their civilization, which was very far from any other nearby civilizations or resources and was a trading hub. They kept it in that centralized location, even though it was getting harder to live there. The Mayans stayed in the temples, even though it was getting harder to provide water for them. The Polynesians on Easter Island destroyed all the trees in order to survive and worship the gods, until the point that there were no more trees on the island. There never has been any trees, and they collapsed by killing themselves in a great orgy of eating human flesh from rival tribes. So when we look at Greece, when we look at Rome, when we look at England, when we look at Easter Island, when we look at the Anasazi, when we look at the Maya, when we look at the Vikings on Greenland, it's the same story. Things worked very well for a very long time, and then they stopped working. And these civilizations couldn't adapt and didn't want to have the conversation about how their basic system no longer worked. They didn't want to have that awkward, hard conversation that said things used to work and now they really, really don't. And so they kept doing what they were doing until it collapsed. There are many examples of this throughout history. And so the question becomes, why do we think that America would be any different? I want to show you a clip real quick. This is from a movie I'm sure many of you have seen.
They say no. People should know when they're conquered.
So here's the part that I love about this. This guy says, looking at the Germans, here are the barbarian Germans, and here are the Roman legions. And his response as a Roman is, look at these barbarians. Clearly they're conquered. They should know when they're conquered. How silly and stupid of them for not knowing that they're being conquered. What's interesting was that at that exact moment, Rome was being conquered. Not by physical people, but the entire system was falling down. So by the time Rome reached the Germanic lands, their entire system was no longer working. Rome worked very well because they would go and conquer nearby states who had gold and silver and goods that were valuable in trade and slaves that they could teach to work their fields. And so it worked very well. They would conquer an area, take all the wealth, bring it back to Rome. That would pay for the military invasion. They would take slaves who they could teach. That would add a free labor workforce, increasing Rome. And then there would be goods that they could take from that area, or they can control the sale of those goods and basically inflate their own economy. When they got up to Germany, there were no goods that anybody in the rest of the Mediterranean wanted. The German people were so uneducated and stupid, according to the Romans, they couldn't be trained to do anything. So there's no slave labor force. And the Germans didn't have the idea that gold and silver were valuable, so there was no money to gain. So by the time Rome got to Germany, was conquering them, it made no economic value to do so. But yet the Romans didn't stop until they were defeated by Hermann the German years later. And so what we see is this scene where the Romans, because they're at a moment of strength, are looking down on another people saying, you idiots, don't you realize collapse is upon you? When actually at that moment, collapse was upon Rome. They didn't look at their economic system. They couldn't change. And so I'd like to bring you the story of America. We're going to review these references, and I'm going to point out how the collapse that you have seen, and I've explained from many other empires, is coming to America and why you should conclude that. Let's take a look at the references real quick just to get them out of the way. Today we're going to be talking about this article by Stephen Marche. Here's Sagar and Jetty. I'm a big fan of his. It was on the show The Realignment, and prepared January 6th. Is the U.S. on a path to dissolution? We're also going to be looking at this article by Politico. Republicans are moving rapidly to cement minority rule. Blame the Constitution. Democracy is in trouble, but lawless coup isn't the real threat. This is where they're talking about how the Constitution itself is the problem with America. Also came out around July 5th, 2020. Here's another one. The LA Times, Capitol Riot anniversary means Western allies fear for the health of U.S. democracy. Again, January 4th. Here's another article we're going to look at. How does this end? Where the crisis in American democracy might be headed. by Vox News, and this came out January 3rd. Finally, we'll be looking at the San Francisco Chronicle Editorial, American Fascism is Still Rising. What are you going to do about it, California? By the editorial board of the San Francisco Chronicle on January 2nd. We will finally mention a CNN article called Is America Headed to Civil War or Secession? And that recently just came out in the last few days. I believe it was January 3rd or 4th. Finally, the scene from Gladiator. I wanted to show you the references so that I don't have to show them again. I just showed you them, so now you can know that they're verified. We're going to get into the article. I'm going to refer to the references. If you'd like to see them yourself, simply click open the description box. All of the reference material is there. You can see the article. Go click through it, look at you want, but I'm not going to cover it again. So the references are in the description. All of the material is going to come from the references. I will tell you which references I'm using, and I just showed you all the references, so that's done. We're now going to move into the analysis for today. Now, I'm going to focus on this episode by Saagar Enjeti it's called Stephen Marche, Is the U.S. on a Path to Dissolution on YouTube. What's key here is that Saagar Enjeti's very wise and very well informed on politics, and he doesn't really do jingoistic or fantastic topics unless he thinks there's some reality to it. So the fact that Saagar Enjeti for the first time is discussing national divorce is key. It means the topic is at least so big that he can't ignore it anymore. Now, here's how they described it. Stephen Marche is the author of The Next Civil War, Dispatches from the American Future, and he joins the realignment that Saagar showed to discuss why he believes America is coming to an end. In that interview with Saagar Enjeti and Stephen Marche on The Next Civil War, at 30 minutes in exactly, basically halfway through the interview, Stephen Marche says, when you can't make a marriage work, you have to become an adult and explain to the kids that a peaceful divorce is better. His whole point is that America is coming to dissolution, and we will either have peaceful national divorce, allowing certain states to leave, or at least one or two, or we will have a violent civil war. Stephen Marche said basically in the interview that divisions are worse now than in the 1960s, versus Saagar Enjeti, who said divisions were worse in the 1960s and America can survive. I'm not going to go into the details, but basically if you watch the interview, you'll see Marche saying divisions now in America are worse than they've ever been since the 60s. And Saagar saying that's not true. Divisions in the 1960s were worse. America survived. Therefore, there's no real issue and America will survive divisions now. That was Saagar's point. Here's the fact. Distrust of fellow Americans and institutions is the worst it's ever been since 1860. So Saagar is dead wrong on this. I'll cover more of that in a second. Here's the other argument that they made. So Stephen Marche said that separation in America is likely. And Saagar Enjeti said there was so much turmoil in the 1960s. People talked about separation in the 1960s and it never happened. Basically, he outright rejects the idea that the discussion now is based upon regions breaking away. Saagar says at 39:11. So at minute 39:11, Saagar says there's no difference between the way people wanted to separate in the 1960s and the way that people wanted to separate now. And if you're going to make the argument that people who want to separate now are doing it based upon regions and the idea of their grievances tied to regions wasn't as existent in the 1960s, you're wrong. Well, Saagar, in fact, is dead wrong. So in 2022, Texas talked about seceding. In 2016, California talked about seceding. New Hampshire recently talked about seceding. East Oregon started talking about seceding. West Colorado started talking about seceding the last few years. West Virginia started talking about seceding again and taking counties with it. North Carolina, Jefferson started talking about secession. Now, none of that happened in the 1960s. In the 1960s, you'd have groups like the Black Panthers, the Weathermen, the Liberation Front, the Ku Klux Klan, George Wallace. All of these people were not saying, we want to form a separate Black Panther country and anybody who's Black in America should come to our area and live there. We want to form a separate Ku Klux Klan country and anybody who wants segregation could come to this one specific state. The Weathermen did not say, let's take on the government and form our own parallel government in the specific state of Wyoming. There was no attachment of geography to these issues. So the Black Panthers said all Black people across America. The Weathermen said everybody who's progressive across America. The Ku Klux Klan and George Wallace talked about the South, but they were also talking about everybody who was against integration. It wasn't focused on a state. Now we have, oh, is Hillary going to be elected? Let's secede in Texas. Is Trump going to be elected? Let's secede. Oh, did Californians move in this area? Let's secede from them. Oh, I don't like the way the country's going. Let's secede. So Sagar is dead wrong. The issues in the 1960s might be the same issues as now, but there was a national cohesion and a national messaging. And now it's regional and isolated, and specifically the topic of I separate and secede is absolutely attached to it. Sagar said that's not true. Stephen Marche said it is true. Stephen Marche was correct, and Sagar was dead wrong. Sagar also made the comment that divisions in America were worse in the 1960s than they are now. That is not true. So it's very sad. I like Sagar. I think he's intelligent, but he is dead wrong. This is the way that division was done in the 1960s. This is the way the division is done now. It's very regional. So Sagar makes the point also that American institutions still work like they did in the past, and it's not that bad. So we don't need to worry about civil war. We had this turmoil in the 1960s, and it's okay. Institutions worked in the 1960s. Americans came together. Institutions still work today. Americans will come together. Actually, Sagar's dead wrong. So faith in American institutions, Congress, presidency, and the judiciary is the lowest it's been in 50 to 60 years. Faith in Congress, the presidency, and the judiciary is lower than it was in the 1960s. That's a fact. How do we know that? Because people are surveying that. Here's the Pew Research Global Polling article, Key Findings About Americans Declining Trust in Government and Each Other, July 2019, directly refuting everything Sagar says. People don't have faith in the Congress, the presidency, or the judiciary, the lowest levels of faith ever seen in decades. Also, people lost faith in financial regulation and the banking system in 2008 when they found out they were lied to. And then they lost faith in the intelligence community and the military when they found out they were also lied to in 2005 by weapons of mass destruction. So we have the lowest amount of faith in all of the institutions in government, way beyond anything seen in the 1960s, directly refuting what Sagar said. Sagar also made the point, hey, American divisions aren't as bad as other failed countries. So all this talk about how America is going to fall apart is ridiculous because America's not as bad as these other countries. So Stephen Marche was talking about how American divisions are similar to Venezuela, and Venezuela is a failed country. And so he's saying America might end up being a failed country, to which Sagar says, no, not true. That's ridiculous. American divisions aren't as bad as other failed countries. That's what Sagar said. So you don't need to worry about national divorce. Well, Sagar was dead wrong. Here's a VOX article that literally came out the day before or the day after Sagar made his comment, where they talk about foreign experts and scholars in America saying that they are afraid about the collapse of America. These scholars also say none of America's peer democracies have experienced levels of pernicious polarization as high for as long as the contemporary United States. So Sagar says, don't compare America to these failed states. That's ridiculous. Literally at the same time, foreign experts are literally saying that. Now, Sagar is a political junkie like me. He is not a foreign relations expert. These people are, and they say America is comparable to failed nations. At the same time, Sagar says, no, they're not. Sorry, Sagar, here we go. LA Times also, at the same time Sagar made that incorrect statement, said, looks like Western allies are worried about the stability of the United States. Another academic study, separate from the one mentioned by Vox, also saying, looks like America's fallen apart. European think tank, the International Institute for Democracy and Elected Assistance, for the first time put the U.S. on a list of backsliding democracies. So here's Sagar and Jeter, politically brilliant, saying you can't compare America to Venezuela or these failed countries. And literally, Vox and LA show two different academic studies where academics around the world are literally doing that at the same time. Sagar also says that division in America isn't the worst ever. It's been worse in points before, and he is very wrong because Here's the Pew Research polling saying division in America is the highest it's been, and lack of faith in American institutions is the highest it's ever been. So institutions aren't working, polarization is worse, and America is being compared to failed states, contradicting everything Sagar said about why we don't need to take the conversation of national divorce seriously. His points to Stephen Marche were, you don't need to take the topic of national divorce seriously. That, things aren't as bad as other countries. Things were worse before, and they got better. And every point Sagar made, he was wrong. So here's a little bit more. And there's a point to this. Now, Sagar said, Americans' institutions work today like they did in the past. It's not that bad. And at the same time that he made that article, the Pew survey was already out saying that's wrong. But literally the day before, the day after he makes the statement, Politico, the most famous, well-respected political magazine in America, says Republicans are moving rapidly to submit minority rule, blame the Constitution. And what Politico is pointing out is that American institutions no longer work at all, and they will never be fixed and never change because they're baked into the Constitution. That's something we've been saying for 2 years here. So here's some of the quotes. The second is the Constitution, which makes it difficult for the national majority to act and easy for local minorities to rule. They overlook its architecture of state power, which erects formidable barriers to equal representation and majority rule in all three branches of government. While some long-standing wealthy democracies do have upper chambers, the United States is one of very few to grant its upper chamber, naming the Senate, equal power to its lower chamber, that means the House. The extreme inequality representation in the Senate, in which the vote of one citizen in Wyoming is equal to that of 67 citizens in California, is even more unique. Wrote the distinguished Yale political scientist Robert Dahl, to preserve and protect unequal representation and to construct a barrier to majority rule. Now, and one last quote, appointed by a president elected with fewer votes than his opponent, and 5 of those justices were appointed by a group of senators representing fewer votes than those against. So what they're talking about is the Electoral College guarantees each state so many votes. The Senate guarantees each state's 2 representatives. So because the Electoral College picks the president instead of a blank majority vote, states, even small states, have more impact on picking the president than they really should. Additionally, because each state gets 2 senators, and that's not based upon population, many small states have outsized influence. When you get to pick the president, who nominates the judges, and you get to pick the Senate, who approves of the judges, you're now in control of the Supreme Court. So you can have minority group of states who represent a fraction of the population pick the president, as happened with Bush and Trump. And then you can have them block all legislation from the House, which they've done in the last couple of years. And you can have them approve extreme right-wing justices appointed by the president, which they did. And then you can effectively own the third branch. And so this is the Politico magazine saying baked into the Constitution is the fact that a minority of the population can run all 3 branches of government because of the Constitution. When it's so baked in the Constitution, it's never going to be fixed. We've been saying that here. America's broke and can't be fixed. Unless you're going to rewrite the entire Constitution, it's not based on democracy. It's based upon states. So here's the conclusion. Sagar's wrong. Divisions are worse now than in the 1960s. Period. Fact. National institutions are failing unlike the 1960s. Fact. And social issues are framed regionally in 2020. Now, I like Sagar. I think he's brilliant. I like seeing a minority brown-skinned guy make it in the world that's mostly dominated by Caucasian males, and I love it as a minority myself. But he's dead wrong. Sagar is brilliant and one of the most informed people in politics and great at debate. Super intelligent, super well-informed, super great at debate. Dead wrong on all of his arguments about why it's not reasonable to discuss national divorce. And to drive the point home, so while Sagar and Jetty was discussing national divorce, CNN and the San Francisco Chronicle also discussed national divorce. San Francisco Chronicle said the potential fall of American democracy. They also said a system of democratic norms that is rapidly eroding at the federal level, and they said a country to collapse into tyranny. So Sagar and Jetty's talking about how America's dissolution of America is a ridiculous topic. And then San Francisco Chronicle at the same time is saying, whoa, potential fall of American democracy, democratic norms eroded across the country, a collapse into tyranny. Isolated event? No, here's the article by San Francisco Chronicle. And then here's an article by CNN at the same time saying the same thing. CNN literally looked into the camera and go, we don't really think this is going to come to pass, right? So my question to you is, why are Sagar and Jetty and the San Francisco Chronicle and the CNN discussing national divorce at the same time? And why is Sagar and Jetty, a well-informed, smart man, making weak arguments that are so easily disproven? It's like he got passionate and emotional instead of analytical, and all of his points were easily defeated. So what does it say about America where it's 2 years after Trump was removed from office, and 3 different publications are talking about the dissolution of America, and one of them, a very smart man, makes multiple arguments about why the dissolution of America will never happen, and he's literally wrong on every single point he makes? What do you think that says? Again, here's the sources. You can check them out yourself. Here's the Sagar and Jetty article where he makes all those arguments that are disproven. Here's the Politico article that talks about how the institutions don't work. It's baked in the Constitution. Here's the Western allies are worried about America's functional democracy. Here's the separate article by Vox where they talk about other academics than this LA Times article also coming to the conclusion that America's falling apart. Here's the editorial by the San Francisco Chronicle talking about how America's falling apart. And here's the article by the CNN at the same time where they literally seriously have to ask, we don't think America's going to fall apart, do we? That's your update of the facts. Let's take a look at some of the comments. If they're good, I'll post them. Let's take a look. A little like talking oil. Bob Timlin, that's a good point. We are worse off than the 1860s, 1960s. Bob Timlin. How many more years? LARPing, the Dutch Burgundy, I don't know what that means. Maybe that you're considering it. Bear Cavalry, the United States is a suggestion at this point. That's a great point. Bear Cavalry, totally agree with that. Unvaccinated American says, I don't think you can make your plan happen until there's a 2-state solution. NorCal is going to want to secede as much as SoCal. So unvaccinated American, you're dead wrong. Sorry, but that's completely incorrect. So California's faced 2 opportunities to split California into multiple states. One was the 6-state solution by Tim Draper. The other was the 3-state solution by Tim Draper. The Public Policy Institute of California did polling when both options were provided. So 6 states, they did polling, PPIC, which is the official think tank of California. Then when Draper came back with his 3-state thing, they also did polling. Both times, the official think tank of California showed 67% of Californians were against splitting up California. So these aren't polls from a decade ago. These are polls from the idea being explored. Tim Draper's plan was known by all Californians both time it came up, and 2/3 of Californians absolutely rejected splitting California up. So nobody's really interested in splitting away except for Jefferson, and there may be 25% of the population. So my question to you, unvaccinated American, is how is 25% of California's population going to convince 67% that they're wrong? Oh, by the way, Jefferson really backed Trump, backed a lot of his racist comments, and they backed it when Trump criticized California. So you want a 25% group of California who hated on California and went out of their way to talk garbage on California to convince 67% of California that they got it wrong. Nothing much, bro. America's falling apart, and it's coming soon, and this might be the way that we can get out. watch the video, and know that I love you. All right, we're going to end it there at 30 minutes in. I tried to make it as short as I could, but this is good information. It will keep you informed. Nobody covers it with the extensiveness that we do here and providing original insight. I'll see you later. And as always, let me get the banner off. Thank you for showing up. And this has been National Divorce Talk Raw with your host, Marc Ruiz Evans.